Somewhere in the forests of Luxembourg in December 1944, a young American soldier stands alone in the darkness inflating a 30-ton Sherman tank with a bicycle pump. The temperature is below freezing. German artillery shells explode in the distance close enough that he can feel the concussions in his chest. Enemy patrols are active in these woods. If they find him here, he will be shot immediately, not as a prisoner of war, but as a spy, because what he is doing violates every rule of conventional warfare. He is not armed with a rifle. He carries no ammunition. His only weapon is an inflatable rubber tank that weighs 65 pounds when deflated and looks completely real when inflated. He works quickly in the darkness, his hands numb from cold, his breath visible in the freezing air. Around him in the forest, other soldiers are setting up more inflatable tanks and fake artillery pieces. They are creating the illusion of an entire armored division where none exists. They are the Ghost Army, and they are about to save thousands of American lives by convincing the Germans that a massive American force is preparing to attack from this position, when in reality, the real American forces are 20 miles south preparing for a completely different operation. If this deception works, the Germans will keep their reserves here waiting for an attack that will never come. If it fails, these unarmed soldiers inflating rubber tanks will be the first to die. This is not a story you learned in school. For 50 years after World War II ended, the American government kept this story classified, refusing to discuss it, publicly forbidding the veterans from talking about what they had done. Only in 1996, more than 50 years after the war, were the documents finally declassified and the story could be told. By then, many of the veterans were dead, taking their secrets to the grave. But those who survived finally spoke about what they had done, and their story is one of the most remarkable of the entire war. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known to history as the Ghost Army. A unit of 1,100 American soldiers who fought World War II not with bullets and bombs, but with inflatable tanks, sound effects, fake radio transmissions, and artistic skill. A unit composed of artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors who used creativity and deception to fool the German army, more than 20 times conducting operations from Normandy to the Rhine River. A unit that military historians now credit with saving between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives by misdirecting German forces away from real attacks. A unit whose members included future famous artists like fashion designer Bill Blass and painter Ellsworth Kelly. A unit that proved sometimes the best weapon is not firepower but imagination. This is the story of the men who won the war by pretending to fight it. The artists who became the most effective soldiers you have never heard of. The Ghost Army did not begin as an American idea. It began in the deserts of North Africa in 1942, when British forces under General Bernard Montgomery faced German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in a desperate struggle for control of Egypt and the Suez Canal. The British were outnumbered and outgunned. Rommel's Afrika Korps had pushed British forces back to El Alamein, just 60 miles from Cairo. If the British lost Egypt, they would lose access to Middle Eastern oil and the Suez Canal, and the entire Mediterranean theatre would fall to Germany. Montgomery needed to attack, but he needed surprise. The problem was that the British forces were massing in the south, preparing to attack around Rommel's southern flank. If the Germans detected this concentration of forces, they would shift their defences and the attack would fail. Montgomery needed the Germans to believe the attack was coming from the north, not the south. So Montgomery turned to a British officer named Dudley Clark, who had been experimenting with military deception. Clark proposed creating a fake build-up in the north using dummy tanks, dummy artillery, and fake supply depots that would look real from German reconnaissance aircraft. The real forces in the south would be camouflaged to look like supply trucks. When German aircraft flew over, they would see what appeared to be a massive British force in the north and a quiet supply area in the south. They would position their defences accordingly. Then when the real attack came from the south, it would catch them completely off guard. Clark's plan worked brilliantly. British forces constructed over 2,000 dummy tanks and vehicles in the northern sector. They built fake supply dumps and fake command posts. They generated fake radio traffic, suggesting a large force preparing for attack. Meanwhile, the real tanks in the south were disguised with large wooden frames to look like trucks from the air. When Montgomery attacked in October 1940, Rommel's forces were positioned to defend against an attack from the north. The real attack from the south broke through with minimal resistance. The Battle of El Alamein became the first major Allied victory in the European theatre, and military deception played a crucial role. American military observers took note. If deception could fool Rommel, it could fool other German commanders. The United States Army began studying British deception techniques and considering how to apply them to American operations. In 1943, as the U.S. prepared for the invasion of Europe, American planners decided they needed their own deception unit, but creating such a unit posed challenges. Conventional soldiers were trained to fight directly to confront the enemy with overwhelming force. Deception required a completely different mindset. It required creativity, improvisation, and the ability to think like a con artist rather than a warrior. The army needed soldiers who could paint convincing camouflage, who could design fake equipment that would fool observers, who could create sound effects that sounded real, who could operate radios and impersonate other units convincingly. In short, they needed artists. In the spring of 1943, recruiters from the United States Army began visiting art schools across the northeastern United States. They went to the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, to the Cooper Union in Manhattan, to the Philadelphia Museum School of Art, to the Corcoran School of Art in Washington. The recruiters were looking for a specific type of recruit. Young men with artistic talent who had already been drafted or were about to be drafted. Men who could paint and draw and design. Men who understood visual illusion and camouflage. Men who could think creatively under pressure. The recruiters did not tell these young men exactly what they would be doing. They simply said the army had special assignments that required artistic skills. Would they be interested? Many young artists jumped at the opportunity. The alternative was being assigned to regular infantry units where their artistic skills would be wasted, and their chances of being killed were high. If the army wanted to use their artistic talents in some way, that seemed much better than carrying a rifle through France. So they volunteered. Among those who volunteered was a young fashion design student from Indiana named Bill Blass, who would after the war become one of America's most famous fashion designers. Another volunteer was Ellsworth Kelly, a 20-year-old from New Jersey, who would become one of the most important abstract painters of the 20th century. Another was Arthur Shilstone, who would become a famous illustrator. Another was Art Kane, who would become a legendary fashion photographer. These men did not know each other yet. They came from different schools, different backgrounds, different cities. But they all had artistic talent, and they all wanted to survive the war, and they all ended up in the same place. The army also recruited from other fields. They needed sound engineers who understood acoustics and recording equipment, so they recruited from radio stations and recording studios. They needed radio operators who could convincingly impersonate other units, so they recruited men with acting experience or radio broadcasting experience. They needed soldiers who could quickly set up and break down equipment, so they recruited stagehands from theatres. The army was essentially creating a theatrical production company disguised as a military unit. By the summer of 1943, the army had assembled about 1,100 men at Camp Forest in Tennessee. The men were told they were now part of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a designation that meant nothing to anyone, including the men themselves. They were also told that everything they were about to learn was classified top secret. They could not tell their families what they were doing. They could not tell other soldiers. If they were captured, they would likely be executed as spies rather than treated as prisoners of war. because what they were about to do violated the rules of warfare as understood at the time. Some men who heard this decided they wanted out. They transferred to other units, but most stayed. They were curious. They wanted to know what kind of secret mission required artists and sound engineers. The training began with an introduction to the equipment that would become the Ghost Army's primary weapons. The first piece of equipment was the inflatable tank. Military planners working with the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company had developed inflatable rubber replicas of Sherman tanks that were remarkably realistic. Each inflatable tank was made of rubberized canvas and came folded in a canvas bag that weighed about 65 pounds. 4 men could unpack and inflate one tank in about 15 minutes using a small air compressor or even a bicycle pump. Once inflated, the tank looked completely real from more than 100 yards away. It had the correct shape and size. It had painted details including unit markings and weathering to make it look used. It even had a fake barrel that could be rotated. From the air, which was how German reconnaissance usually observed Allied positions, the inflatable tanks were indistinguishable from real ones. The Ghost Army would eventually have hundreds of these inflatable tanks. They also had inflatable jeeps, inflatable trucks, inflatable artillery pieces, and inflatable anti-aircraft guns. An entire fake armored division could be set up in a few hours by a few dozen men. A real armored division required thousands of men and took days to position. The Ghost Army could create the illusion of military strength where none existed, and they could do it quickly and quietly. But visual deception alone was not enough. German intelligence did not rely only on aerial reconnaissance. They listened to radio traffic. Every American military unit had specific radio procedures, specific call signs, specific transmission patterns. German signals intelligence officers monitored American radio transmissions, constantly trying to track unit movements by following their radio signatures. If the Ghost Army was going to impersonate real units, they needed to generate fake radio traffic that matched the patterns of those units exactly. This required a group of soldiers called the Signal Company Special. These men were trained radio operators, but their job was not to communicate real information. Their job was to impersonate other units. They would study the radio procedures of a real unit. It learn its call signs, learn its transmission schedules, learn the personal quirks of its radio operators. Then, when the Ghost Army set up a deception operation, the Signal Company would begin broadcasting fake messages pretending to be that unit. They would send routine traffic requests for supplies, reports on weather, updates on troop positions, all completely fake but completely consistent with how that unit normally communicated. German intelligence listening to these transmissions would conclude that unit was in that location when in reality it was somewhere else entirely. The third element of deception was sound. Tank movements make distinctive noises. The rumble of engines, the clank of treads on pavement, the squeak of suspension systems. At night, when visual observation was impossible, German troops relied on sound to track enemy movements. If they heard tanks moving in a certain direction, they would report it to headquarters, and German commanders would position their forces accordingly. The Ghost Army realized they could exploit this by creating fake sounds. The Army's Special Services Division, working with engineers from Bell Laboratories, developed a sonic deception system. They made high-quality recordings of various military sounds. Tanks starting and moving, trucks driving in convoy, artillery being moved, infantry units marching, engineers assembled. These recordings on large spools of wire were played through massive speakers mounted on half-tracks. The speakers weighed 500 pounds each and could project sound up to 15 miles away under the right atmospheric conditions. A small team with a few half-tracks and speakers could create the acoustic signature of an entire division on the move. German listening posts would hear what sounded like hundreds of vehicles and report a major movement, when in reality it was just recordings playing in a forest. The fourth element was camouflage and visual misdirection. Real military equipment had to be hidden. Fake equipment had to look real. The artists in the Ghost Army became experts at both. They learned to use camouflage, netting natural vegetation, and clever positioning to hide real tanks from aerial observation. They learned to paint fake shadows on inflatable tanks to make them look three-dimensional from the air. They learned to add details like fake tread marks in the mud around inflatable tanks to make it look like the tanks had actually driven there and parked. They learned to make new fake equipment look weathered and used by adding paint and dirt in the right places. Attention to detail was everything. A single mistake, a shadow going the wrong direction, or a tread mark that did not match the supposed vehicle could give away the entire deception. The men trained for months learning these skills. They practiced setting up inflatable tanks in darkness. They practiced broadcasting fake radio traffic under pressure. They rehearsed sound operations, coordinating the speakers and recordings. They studied aerial photographs, learning to see their own work the way German reconnaissance would see it, and they were drilled constantly on security. They could not tell anyone what they were doing. If they went into a nearby town on leave, and someone asked what their unit did, they were instructed to say they were a camouflage unit or a headquarters unit, which was vague enough to be meaningless. The punishment for revealing the true nature of their mission was court, martial, and potentially execution because lives depended on secrecy. In early 1940, the Ghost Army received orders. They were going to Europe. The invasion of France was being planned for June, and the Ghost Army would play a role, though they were not told exactly what that role would be. In May 1940, the unit boarded transport ships at New York Harbor and sailed across the Atlantic as part of a massive convoy, carrying hundreds of thousands of American troops to England. The crossing took 2 weeks. The men spent the time seasick, crowded into transport holds, with thousands of other soldiers trying not to think about German U-boats. They arrived in England in late May and were stationed at camps in the southern part of the country near the coast. England in the spring of 1944 was one enormous military base. Over 2 million Allied soldiers were gathering for the invasion. American, British, Canadian, Polish, and Free French forces were training staging equipment, preparing for D-Day. The Ghost Army was part of this massive build-up, but they still did not know exactly what they would be doing. Then in early June, they received their first mission briefing. The invasion of Normandy was scheduled for June 6th. After the initial landings, Allied forces would begin pushing inland, securing beachheads and expanding the controlled territory. The Germans would be watching, trying to figure out where the main Allied effort was concentrated so they could move their reserves to counterattack. The Ghost Army's job was to confuse German intelligence by making it appear that large American forces were in locations where they were not. This would force the Germans to spread their defenses thin or move their reserves to defend against threats that did not exist. The Ghost Army would not land on D-Day itself. They would arrive in the days following once the beachheads were secure, but they needed to be ready to begin operations immediately. The men loaded their equipment onto transport ships. Inflatable tanks packed in canvas bags, speakers and recording equipment, radio gear, camouflage materials, paint and brushes, everything they would need to create illusions on French soil. On June 6, 1944, the invasion began. The men of the Ghost Army listened to news reports on the radio and watched as wave after wave of aircraft flew overhead toward France. They heard about the bloody fighting on Omaha Beach, about the paratroopers scattered across Normandy, about the desperate efforts to secure the beachhead. Thousands of American soldiers were dying on the beaches of France, while the Ghost Army sat in England waiting. Some men felt guilty. They were artists and technical specialists, not combat infantry. They would not be storming beaches or fighting in the hedgerows. But their commanders reminded them that their mission was just as important. If they did their job right, they would save more lives than any infantry unit it could save by fighting directly. On June 15th, the Ghost Army boarded landing craft and crossed the English Channel to France. They landed at Untold Beach, which by then was secure and relatively quiet. American engineers had cleared the beach obstacles and built temporary piers for unloading equipment. The Ghost Army's trucks and half-tracks rolled off the landing craft onto French soil. The men formed up and began moving inland. They could still hear artillery in the distance. The front lines were only a few miles away. This was not a safe rear area. This was an active war zone, and the Ghost Army was about to conduct its first operation. The first Ghost Army operation in France was code, named Operation Elephant. The objective was to impersonate the 2nd Armored Division, which was one of the most famous American armored units. The real 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, was being moved from one sector to another for an offensive operation. But military planners did not want the Germans to know the division had moved. If the Germans realized the 2nd Armored was gone from its previous position, they might launch an attack there, or they might figure out where it was going and prepare defenses. So the Ghost Army was ordered to take the place of the 2nd Armored Division and make the Germans believe it was still in its old position. The Ghost Army moved into the area the 2nd Armored had just vacated and began setting up the deception. Teams of men unloaded inflatable tanks and began inflating them, positioning them in fields and along roads where German reconnaissance aircraft would spot them. Other teams set up camouflage netting and artillery positions. The sonic deception crews set up their speakers in the woods and began playing recordings of tank movements at night to create the impression that the division was repositioning. The radio operators began broadcasting fake messages using the 2nd Armored Division's call signs and procedures, pretending to be the division, headquarters, requesting supplies, coordinating movements, reporting on troop readiness. The operation ran for 6 days. During that time, German reconnaissance aircraft flew over the area multiple times, photographing the fake positions. German artillery occasionally fired on the fake positions, wasting shells on inflatable tanks. German radio intelligence monitored the fake transmissions and updated their maps showing the 2nd Armored still in place. Meanwhile, the real 2nd Armored Division was 50 miles away preparing for its actual attack, completely unmolested by German forces because the Germans thought it was still in its old position. The operation was a success. The 2nd Armored launched its attack and achieved complete surprise. German forces in the area were caught unprepared because they had allocated 0 reserves to that sector, believing the 2nd Armored was still in the location where the Ghost Army had impersonated it. The attack broke through German lines with minimal casualties. Allied intelligence later captured German documents showing that German commanders had completely believed the deception. They had no idea they had been fooled by inflatable tanks and sound effects. For the men of the Ghost Army, Operation Elephant was both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because their deception had worked. The fake tanks had looked real enough. The radio traffic had been convincing. The sounds had fooled German listening posts. Everything they had trained to do had succeeded, but it was also terrifying because they realized how dangerous their job was. They were setting up fake equipment close to enemy lines, often within artillery range. They were unarmed or lightly armed. If German forces had launched a ground attack on their positions, they would have been slaughtered. They were completely dependent on the deception holding. If the Germans figured out they were fake, the Ghost Army soldiers would be dead before they could escape. But the operation had worked, and that gave the Ghost Army confidence. They had proven their concept in combat. Over the next 10 months, they would conduct over 20 more operations, each more ambitious and dangerous than the last. And they would become the most effective deception unit in military history. The inflatable tanks became the most iconic element of the Ghost Army's deceptions, and understanding how they worked requires appreciating both their technical sophistication and their limitations. Each inflatable Sherman tank was a masterpiece of industrial design created by Goodyear engineers working in secret. The tank was constructed from multiple panels of rubberized canvas that were sealed together to create an airtight structure. The panels were printed with paint to create realistic details, including rivets, hatches, periscopes, track wheels, and the main gun. The printing was so detailed that from 100 yards away, even an experienced tanker could not tell the difference between an inflatable tank and a real one just by looking. The tank came folded in a canvas bag that 4 men could carry. To set it up, the men would unfold the tank, connect an air compressor or pump, and inflate it. As air filled the structure, the tank would slowly take shape, rising from a flat mass of rubber into a recognizable Sherman tank. The entire process took about 15 minutes if the crew was experienced. Once inflated, the tank was held rigid by air pressure. It would stay inflated for days unless punctured. If deflation was needed, the air could be released and the tank would collapse back into a portable bundle. But the inflatable tank had vulnerabilities. It looked real from a distance, but up close the deception was obvious. The rubber texture was different from metal. The tank made no sound. It left no tread marks when moved. It weighed only 65 pounds, while a real Sherman weighed over 30 tons. If German troops got close enough to inspect the tank, they would immediately realize it was fake. This meant the Ghost Army had to position inflatable tanks far enough from enemy lines that German ground patrols could not easily reach them. But they had to be close enough that German aerial reconnaissance would photograph them. Finding that balance was critical, the Ghost Army developed techniques to make the inflatable tanks more convincing. They positioned tanks at angles that matched how real tanks would be positioned. They created fake tread marks in the mud by dragging chains behind trucks. They placed camouflage netting over some tanks to make it look like crews were trying to hide them, which paradoxically made German observers more likely to believe they were real, because why would anyone bother camouflaging a fake tank? They added details like fake crew helmets placed on the turret or empty fuel cans scattered nearby. Every small detail added to the realism. The Ghost Army also had inflatable versions of other vehicles. Inflatable jeeps that weighed almost nothing but looked real from above. Inflatable trucks. Inflatable artillery pieces, including howitzers and anti-aircraft guns. They even had inflatable aircraft for operations near airfields, though these were used less frequently because it was harder to position them convincingly. An entire fake military base could be set up in hours using inflatables and a small crew. From the air, it would look like a major military installation with hundreds of vehicles and dozens of aircraft. German reconnaissance would photograph it, and German intelligence would conclude that significant Allied forces were concentrated there. German commanders would have to account for this threat in their planning, which meant diverting forces away from where the real attack would come. But creating visual deception was only part of the challenge. The Ghost Army had to make the fake positions look active. Static positions with no movement would raise suspicion, so the Ghost Army used real vehicles to create the impression of activity. A single truck would drive around the fake position, creating dust and movement visible from the air. Men would walk between fake positions as if conducting maintenance or patrols. At night, small fires would be lit to simulate camp cooking. Everything was choreographed to create the illusion that this fake position was a living, breathing military unit. The artists in the Ghost Army were essential to making this work. They understood visual perception. They knew how light and shadow worked. They knew how to create convincing illusions. Many of these men had studied fine art or commercial art before the war. Now they were applying their skills to military deception, painting fake shadows on inflatable tanks, positioning equipment to create convincing compositions, studying photographs taken by Allied reconnaissance to see their own work from the enemy's perspective. It was art in service of war, and it was astonishingly effective. While the inflatable tanks fooled German eyes, the sonic deception program fooled German ears, and in some ways the audio deception was even more important than the visual because it worked at night, and in bad weather when visual observation was impossible. The sonic deception program was developed by engineers at Bell Laboratories working with military planners. The goal was to create recordings of military sounds that were so realistic German listeners would not be able to tell they were fake. The engineers started by recording real military units. They went to training areas and recorded Sherman tanks, starting their engines, idling, moving at various speeds, accelerating and decelerating. They recorded the sounds of tank treads on different surfaces, including pavement, dirt, mud, and gravel. They recorded trucks in convoy with multiple vehicles at different distances. They recorded artillery pieces being moved and positioned. They recorded infantry units marching. They recorded bridge construction and other engineering activities. Every sound that a military unit would make during normal operations was captured. The recordings were made on wire recorders, which at the time were cutting-edge technology. A thin steel wire passed through a recording head that magnetized patterns onto the wire corresponding to sound waves. The wire could then be played back through speakers to recreate the original sound. The system was remarkably high fidelity for 1944. The recordings captured not just the main sounds, but all the background noises, the squeaks and rattles and mechanical sounds that made military equipment distinctive. The Ghost Army's sonic unit received these recordings on large spools of wire. They also received massive speakers that had been specially designed for sound projection. Each speaker weighed 500 pounds and was mounted in a heavy crate attached to a half-track. The speakers used powerful amplifiers that could drive sound levels high enough to be heard miles away. Under ideal atmospheric conditions, a sonic deception operation could be heard up to 15 miles from the source. Even under normal conditions, the sounds would carry 3 to 5 miles, which was more than enough to reach German listening posts. The sonic unit would position their half-tracks in locations where they wanted Germans to hear military activity, usually near the front lines, but in areas where German ground patrols were unlikely to approach. They would set up the speakers pointing toward German positions. Then at night they would begin playing the recordings. The sounds would carry through the darkness. German soldiers in their foxholes and listening posts would hear what sounded like American tanks moving, what sounded like a large convoy, what sounded like engineers building a bridge. They would report these sounds to their intelligence officers. The intelligence officers would mark their maps showing suspected American movements in those areas, and German commanders would make decisions based on that information. The sonic deceptions were timed to coordinate with other elements of the Ghost Army's operations. If the Ghost Army was impersonating an armored division moving to a new position, the sonic unit would play recordings of tanks moving at night to create the audio signature of that movement. If they were impersonating an infantry division, the sonic unit would play recordings of trucks bringing in supplies and reinforcements. The sounds matched the visual story being told by the inflatable equipment and the fake radio traffic. Every element supported the overall deception narrative, but sonic deception was dangerous work. The half-track crews had to position their vehicles close to enemy lines to ensure Germans could hear the sounds. This put them at risk from German artillery and patrols. The speakers made noise that could draw enemy fire, and if Germans realized they were hearing recordings rather than real equipment, the entire deception would collapse and the sonic crews would be obvious targets. The men who operated the sonic equipment were some of the bravest in the Ghost Army because they had to sit in their half-tracks playing recordings, while German artillery shells exploded around them, hoping the deception held, hoping the Germans did not send a patrol to investigate, hoping they would survive the night. One sonic operator later described the experience as surreal. Sitting in a darkened half-track in a French forest playing recordings of tanks while real artillery fire whistled overhead. Knowing that German soldiers a few miles away were listening to those same recordings and believing they were real. Knowing that if the Germans figured out it was fake, they would come looking for the source. The psychological pressure was intense, but the sonic crews did their job night after night, operation after operation, and their deceptions worked. The third pillar of the Ghost Army's deception capabilities was radio spoofing, conducted by a unit called the Signal Company Special. Radio deception was perhaps the most technically demanding aspect of the Ghost Army's work, because it required not just technical knowledge, but also performance skill. The radio operators had to convince German signals intelligence that they were real radio operators from real units, which meant learning and imitating the operational procedures and personal quirks of those units down to the smallest detail. Every American military unit had distinctive radio procedures. Different divisions used different call signs, different frequency schedules, different encryption methods. Radio operators within each unit developed personal styles in how they transmitted Morse code. Some operators sent code quickly with sharp, precise pulses. Others sent it more slowly with softer pulses. Experienced German signals intelligence officers could recognize individual American radio operators by their personal sending style, which Germans called their fist. If the Ghost Army was going to impersonate a unit, they had to replicate not just the UN, its official procedures, but also the individual quirks of its radio operators. The signal company Special studied this intensively. Before an operation, they would monitor the radio transmissions of the unit they were going to impersonate. They would record the transmissions and analyze them, noting the call signs, the encryption patterns, the message form, that's the transmission schedules. They would study individual operators trying to learn their fist. Then, when the operation began, the signal company operators would begin transmitting, pretending to be the unit they had studied. They would use the correct call signs. They would follow the correct procedures. They would even try to match the personal sending style of the real operators. The content of the messages was carefully scripted. The Ghost Army could not send random gibberish because that would be detected immediately. They had to send messages that sounded like legitimate military communications, so they sent routine administrative traffic, requests for supplies, reports on vehicle maintenance, weather updates, status reports on troop readiness, messages about mail delivery and personnel transfers, all the mundane communications that real military units sent every day, nothing dramatic or obviously fake, just the routine chatter that filled military radio networks. But within this routine traffic, they embedded small pieces of information that would build the deception narrative. A message requesting tank parts would suggest the unit had tanks in the area. A message about personnel transfers would suggest the unit was at full strength. A message scheduling a reconnaissance patrol would suggest the unit was planning offensive operations. Each small piece of information was plausible by itself, but collectively they created a picture of a real unit operating in that location. The Germans monitored Allied radio traffic constantly. German signals intelligence units had listening posts all along the front collecting transmissions, analyzing them, trying to track Allied unit movements. When the signal company Special began broadcasting fake transmissions, the Germans added this traffic to their analysis. They updated their maps showing the fake unit in the location where the Ghost Army was operating. They reported this information to German commanders, and German commanders made operational decisions based on it. Radio deception had one huge advantage over visual and sonic deception. Radio waves traveled hundreds of miles. A radio transmission from a Ghost Army position could be picked up by German listening posts across a wide area. This meant a small team of radio operators could convince Germans across an entire region that a unit was present when it was not. The Germans did not have to see or hear the unit. They just had to detect its radio signature, which they trusted, because radio transmissions were hard to fake, or so the Germans believed. But radio deception also had risks. If the Germans detected inconsistencies in the fake transmissions, they might realize they were being deceived. If a Ghost Army operator made a mistake, used the wrong call sign, or sent a message that contradicted what the real unit would send, the Germans might catch it. The pressure on the signal company operators was constant. They had to be perfect in their impersonations because a single mistake could compromise the entire operation. In August 1940, the Ghost Army received orders for one of its most ambitious operations yet, code, named Operation Brest, The target was the city of Brest on the western tip of Brittany in France. Brest was a major German naval base and port. The Germans had fortified it heavily with thousands of troops, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and coastal defenses. American forces had besieged Brest and were preparing for a major assault to capture the city. But the Germans had strong defenses, and American planners expected heavy casualties. The plan was to use the Ghost Army to create a deception that would draw German defenders away from the actual assault point. The Ghost Army would set up fake positions to the east of Brest, making it appear that a major American force was preparing to attack from that direction. Meanwhile, the real American forces would concentrate to the south and attack from there. If the Germans shifted forces to defend against the fake eastern threat, the real southern assault would face weaker defenses. The Ghost Army moved into position east of Brest and began the largest deception operation they had conducted so far. They set up hundreds of inflatable tanks and artillery pieces, creating the visual appearance of two full divisions preparing for attack. They positioned the equipment in fields and along roads in areas visible to German observation posts on the hills around Brest. They ran real trucks and jeeps around the fake positions, creating dust and movement. They set up command post tents and fake antenna arrays. The sonic unit positioned their speakers in forests near the front lines and began playing recordings at night. The sounds of tanks moving, artillery being positioned, infantry digging trenches. The sounds carried across the fields to German positions. German soldiers reported hearing major American movements to the east. The signal company Special began broadcasting fake radio traffic. They impersonated the headquarters of two divisions, coordinating reconnaissance patrols, discussing supply needs, planning attack routes. The radio traffic was picked up by German signals intelligence. The operation ran for 10 days. During that time, German reconnaissance flights photographed the fake positions. German commanders studied the photographs and the intelligence reports and concluded that the Americans were preparing a major assault from the east. The Germans shifted some of their reserves to defend that sector. They moved artillery to cover the approaches from the east. They fortified defensive positions on the eastern side of the city. Then the real American assault came from the south. The attack was still difficult because Brest's defenses were strong, but it succeeded more quickly and with fewer casualties than expected because German forces had been partially diverted to defend against the fake threat from the east. When the city fell, American intelligence officers interviewed captured German commanders. The Germans confirmed they had believed an attack was coming from the east. They had seen the tanks and heard the sounds and monitored the radio traffic. They had moved forces to defend against that threat. They had been completely deceived. Operation Brest demonstrated that the Ghost Army could conduct large-scale, sustained deception operations. They could maintain a fake presence for days or weeks, creating a continuing threat that German commanders had to account for, and the operation showed that deception could have strategic impact. The Germans had diverted forces based on fake intelligence. Real American lives had been saved because German troops were in the wrong place when the real attack came. But the operation also showed the dangers the Ghost Army faced. During the operation, German artillery fired on some of the fake positions. Shells exploded among inflatable tanks, destroying some of them. The Ghost Army soldiers setting up equipment were exposed to this fire. Several men were wounded by shrapnel. One man was killed. The Ghost Army was learning that even though they were fighting with fake equipment, the danger was real. German shells did not distinguish between real tanks and fake ones. If you were standing next to an inflatable tank, when artillery hit you died just as surely as if you had been standing next to a real tank. In December 1944, the Ghost Army faced its greatest challenge. On December 16th, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last major offensive on the Western Front. 3 German armies broke through thinly held American lines, creating a bulge in the Allied front line and driving toward the Meuse River and the port of Antwerp. American forces were caught completely off guard. Entire divisions were encircled. Supply lines were cut. In the first days of the battle, the situation was chaotic, with American units retreating in confusion and German forces advancing rapidly. The Ghost Army was positioned in Luxembourg when the German offensive began. They could hear the artillery and see American units falling back. Orders came from headquarters. The Ghost Army was to help hold the southern shoulder of the German Bulge by creating the illusion that American forces in that area were stronger than they actually were. Real American divisions were being rushed north to contain the German breakthrough. The Ghost Army had to convince the Germans that those divisions were still in the south, so German forces would not wheel south and expand the breakthrough even further. The Ghost Army moved into positions along the southern edge of the German advance and began setting up deceptive positions in terrible conditions. It was mid-winter. Temperatures were below freezing. Snow fell constantly. The ground was frozen, making it difficult to position equipment. The men worked in darkness because German aircraft were active, and any lights would draw attacks. They set up inflatable tanks in fields along roads anywhere German reconnaissance might see them. They set up sonic equipment and began playing recordings of American armor movements. They broadcast fake radio traffic, but this operation was different from previous ones. This was not a quiet sector where the Ghost Army could set up deceptions without interference. This was an active battlefield with German forces attacking. The Ghost Army positions were under threat from German patrols and German artillery. The men had to work while under fire, setting up fake equipment while real bullets and shells were flying. Several times German patrols got close enough to Ghost Army positions that the deception teams had to pack up and withdraw before they were discovered. The Ghost Army maintained its deception for 2 weeks during the most critical phase of the Battle of the Bulge. They created the appearance of multiple American divisions holding the southern flank. German commanders studying intelligence reports saw evidence of strong American forces in that area. They decided not to push south, instead focusing their efforts on driving west toward the Meuse. This allowed real American forces to stabilize the southern shoulder of the Bulge and eventually begin the counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back. The Battle of the Bulge was the deadliest battle for American forces in World War II, with nearly 20,000 Americans killed. But military historians later concluded that casualties would have been much higher if the Germans had successfully expanded the Bulge southward. The Ghost Army's deception operations helped prevent that expansion by convincing German commanders that the south was too heavily defended. The Ghost Army could not stop the German offensive, but they helped contain it, and that saved lives. The Battle of the Bulge also brought home to the Ghost Army soldiers just how dangerous their mission was. They had been setting up fake equipment within range of German guns. They had been operating in areas where German patrols were active. Several Ghost Army soldiers were wounded during the battle. One was captured, though he managed to escape before the Germans discovered he was part of a deception unit. The men realized that their job, while different from frontline combat troops, was no less dangerous. They could die just as easily as infantry. The difference was they would die while setting up inflatable tanks rather than charging enemy positions. In March 1945, Allied forces were preparing to cross the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier protecting Germany itself. The crossing was scheduled to take place at multiple points along the Rhine. One of the main crossing points would be near the town of Viersen in western Germany. American 9th Army would establish a bridgehead, cross the river with overwhelming force, and drive into the German heartland. But German forces were defending the Rhine desperately. They knew that once the Allies crossed the Rhine, Germany's defeat was inevitable. They would fight fiercely to prevent the crossing. American planners wanted to deceive the Germans about where the main crossings would occur. They wanted German forces concentrated in the wrong areas so the real crossing points would face lighter opposition. The Ghost Army was given a critical mission. They would create the appearance of preparations for a major crossing at a location 10 miles south of the actual crossing site. If the Germans believed the crossing would happen there, they would position their reserves to defend that area. The real crossing to the north would then face weaker defenses. This operation code, named Operation Viersen, was the Ghost Army's most dangerous mission. They would be operating directly on the west bank of the Rhine within sight and artillery range of German positions on the east bank. They would be setting up fake equipment right under German noses. If the Germans realized it was a deception, they could destroy the Ghost Army positions with concentrated artillery fire. And if German commandos crossed the river to investigate, they would discover the deception immediately. The Ghost Army moved into position near the Rhine in late March. The river at this point was over 1,000 feet wide, and German observation posts on the east bank had clear views of the west bank. The Ghost Army had to create a convincing deception in full view of the enemy. They set up inflatable assault boats along the riverbank, as if preparing for a crossing. They positioned inflatable artillery pieces on the high ground overlooking the river. They set up command post tents and communication equipment. They had real trucks moving constantly between positions, creating dust and activity. The sonic unit was brought up close to the river and began playing recordings of engineering activities, the sounds of pontoon bridges being assembled, outboard motors being tested, infantry units moving into assault positions, all the sounds associated with preparations for a river crossing, the sounds carried across the water to German positions. The signal company special broadcast fake radio traffic, messages about boat assignments and crossing schedules and artillery support plans. German signals intelligence picked up all of it. For 3 days, the Ghost Army maintained this deception directly under German observation. German artillery fired on the fake positions. Shells exploded among the inflatable equipment. Several inflatable boats were destroyed. The Ghost Army soldiers had to work during the day to maintain the deception, replacing destroyed equipment, adjusting positions, keeping up the appearance of activity. They could see German soldiers across the river watching them through binoculars. They knew German artillery was zeroing in on their positions, but they stayed. Then, on the night of March 23rd, the real 9th Army crossings began 10 miles north of the Ghost Army positions. American forces crossed the Rhine in strength, establishing bridgeheads on the east bank. German forces defending that area were caught partially off guard because they had positioned reserves to the south, where the Ghost Army had convinced them the main crossing would occur. By the time the Germans realized their mistake, American forces were already across in strength. The Ghost Army packed up and withdrew. Operation Viersen was complete. Intelligence officers later interviewed captured German officers who confirmed that German commanders had expected a major crossing at the location where the Ghost Army had been operating. They had moved artillery and reserves to defend that area. When the real crossings came to the north, the Germans had fewer forces available to respond. The deception had worked even though the Ghost Army had been in clear view of German positions the entire time. Operation Viersen was considered the Ghost Army's finest operation because it succeeded under the most difficult conditions. They had conducted a deception directly under enemy observation. They had maintained it for days despite being under fire. And they had achieved the objective of deceiving German commanders about Allied intentions at a critical moment. But it had also been terrifying. Several Ghost Army soldiers were wounded by German artillery during the operation. The men who participated never forgot the experience of setting up fake equipment knowing German artillery was targeting them, knowing discovery meant death, and doing it anyway because the mission required it. Among the 1,100 men of the Ghost Army were some who would become famous artists after the war, and understanding their experiences provides insight into how creative people adapted to military service and how war shaped their art. Bill Blass arrived at the Ghost Army from Indiana, where he had been studying fashion design. He was 20, 1 year old, artistic and openly gay at a time when homosexuality could end a military career. But the Ghost Army was different from regular army units. It was full of artists and creative people, many of whom did not fit the conventional military mold. The unit tolerated eccentricity because creativity was their mission. Blas worked on the camouflage team, painting fake shadows on inflatable tanks, designing fake unit insignia, and creating visual deceptions. He found the work fascinating. Fashion design and military deception both involved creating illusions, manipulating perception, making people see what you wanted them to see. After the war, Blas would become one of America's premier fashion designers, creating elegant clothing for wealthy clients. He rarely talked publicly about his ghost army service, but in private he said the experience had taught him the power of illusion and the importance of attention to detail. A fake shadow painted in the wrong place could compromise an entire deception operation. Similarly, a seam sewn incorrectly could ruin an entire garment. The standards of precision he learned in the Ghost Army stayed with him throughout his career. Ellsworth Kelly joined the Ghost Army as a 21-year-old artist from New Jersey. He had studied art before being drafted, and he joined the Ghost Army hoping to continue his artistic development while serving his country. He was assigned to the camouflage unit where he painted camouflage patterns on real equipment and designed fake installations. The work required thinking about visual perception, color theory, and how objects appeared from different angles, particularly from above. After the war, Kelly would become one of the most important abstract painters of the 20th century, known for his large color field paintings and his exploration of how viewers perceive color and form. In interviews late in his life, Kelly said his Ghost Army experience had influenced his artistic thinking. He had learned to see like a camera from above, to reduce complex scenes to shapes and colors, to understand how context affected perception. The skills he developed painting camouflage for military deception carried over into his art. Arthur Shilstone was another Ghost Army artist who would become famous after the war, though in a different field. Shilstone worked on the visual deception team, creating fake military installations. He had a talent for drawing quickly and accurately, which was essential for designing deception operations. After the war, Shilstone became one of America's most successful illustrators, working for magazines like National Geographic and the Saturday Evening Post. His illustrations often depicted historical scenes and military subjects drawn with meticulous accuracy. He credited his Ghost Army experience with teaching him to work under pressure and to pay attention to authentic details. In the Ghost Army, if a detail was wrong, Germans would notice, and the deception would fail. That same attention to accuracy served him well as an illustrator. Art Kane joined the Ghost Army as a young photographer and artist. He worked on documenting the unit's operations, taking photographs that would be used for after-action reports. He also helped design fake installations using his understanding of photography to create scenes that would look real when photographed by German reconnaissance. After the war, Kane became one of the most important fashion and portrait photographers of the mid-20th century. His photographs of musicians and celebrities were known for their innovative compositions and dramatic lighting. In interviews, Kane said the Ghost Army had taught him to think about how photographs deceive and mislead as much as how they reveal truth. A photograph shows what the photographer wants you to see, not necessarily what is really there. That understanding shaped his approach to photography. Not all Ghost Army members became famous, but all of them were changed by the experience. Young men who had been art students or commercial artists or designers suddenly found themselves using their creative skills in life and death situations. The deceptions they created saved lives. The attention to detail they brought to their work made the difference between success and failure. And the experience of using art as a weapon gave them a different perspective on what art could do. Art was not just for galleries and museums. It could be practical and strategic. It could fool enemies and save friends. That realization stayed with them. When the war ended in May 1945, the Ghost Army was disbanded. The unit had conducted 21 major deception operations across France, Luxembourg, and Germany. They had impersonated over a dozen different divisions. They had fooled German commanders repeatedly. Military analysts estimated that their deceptions had saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives, by misdirecting German forces away from real attacks. By any measure, the Ghost Army had been one of the most successful units of the war. But when the soldiers returned home, they could not talk about what they had done. The United States Army classified the entire Ghost Army operation as top secret. All documents were locked away. The inflatable tanks and sonic equipment were destroyed or hidden. The techniques the Ghost Army had developed were considered too valuable to reveal because the army wanted to use similar deception tactics in future conflicts. The veterans were ordered not to discuss their service. They were forbidden from mentioning the Ghost Army at all. If anyone asked what they had done during the war, they were instructed to say they had been in a camouflage unit, which was vague enough to be meaningless. For 50 years this secrecy held. Ghost Army veterans returned to civilian life and said nothing. Some of them, like Bill Blass and Ellsworth Kelly, became famous in their fields, but they never publicly discussed their military service. Other veterans worked regular jobs, raised families, and kept their wartime experiences private. Some tried to organize Ghost Army reunions, but the Army prohibited them. The official position was that the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had never existed. This secrecy was frustrating for the veterans. They had participated in important operations. They had contributed to Allied victory, but they received no recognition because no one was allowed to know what they had done. Unlike infantry veterans or bomber crews or tank commanders who could share their experiences and be honored for their service, Ghost Army veterans had to remain silent. Their families often did not know the details of what they had done. Their friends did not understand why they could not talk about the war. The secrecy also meant the historical record was incomplete. Historians writing about World War II had no access to Ghost Army documents. The deception operations remained classified. Books and documentaries about the war did not mention the Ghost Army because the information was not available. An entire dimension of Allied strategy was hidden from public knowledge. In the 1980s, some Ghost Army veterans began pushing for declassification. They argued that enough time had passed. The Cold War was ending. The techniques the Ghost Army had used were outdated. There was no reason to keep the operation secret any longer. The veterans wanted their story told before they all died. They wanted recognition for what they had done. They wanted future generations to know that creativity and deception had played a role in winning the war. The army resisted at first, but eventually began the declassification process. In 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended, the Ghost Army documents were finally declassified and released to the public. Veterans could now talk freely about their service. Historians could access the records. The story of the Ghost Army could finally be told. Once the Ghost Army story became public, it generated enormous interest. Journalists wrote articles about the secret unit that had fooled Hitler. Filmmakers produced documentaries interviewing surviving veterans. Museums created exhibits displaying Ghost Army equipment and artwork. The story captured public imagination because it was so unusual. Inflatable tanks, sound effects, artists as soldiers. It seemed almost fictional, but it was all documented fact. Ghost Army veterans suddenly found themselves being recognized for their service. They were invited to speak at schools and museums. They were interviewed for oral history projects. They appeared at military ceremonies. After decades of silence, they could finally share their experiences, and the public wanted to hear them. Many veterans said the recognition meant a great deal because they had waited so long for it. In 2019, the United States Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. The medal recognized the Ghost Army's unique contribution to Allied victory and honored the creativity and courage of the soldiers who had conducted deception operations. By this time, most Ghost Army veterans had died, but a handful of survivors attended the ceremony in Washington. They received their medals decades after the war, but the recognition was still meaningful. Museums began acquiring Ghost Army artifacts. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans created a Ghost Army exhibit featuring one of the few surviving inflatable tanks and examples of the sonic equipment. The Smithsonian acquired Ghost Army artwork, including paintings and sketches that soldiers had created during the war. These artifacts helped tell the story to a new generation. The Ghost Army story also prompted discussions about military deception more broadly. Military historians began studying how deception had been used in World War II and how it might be used in modern conflicts. The principles the Ghost Army demonstrated remained relevant. Deception could achieve strategic effects at low cost. A small unit with creativity could accomplish things that required far larger conventional forces. The Ghost Army's legacy was not just their specific operations, but the proof that deception deserved a place in military planning. The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond their specific World War II operations. They demonstrated principles about military effectiveness that remain relevant. First, they showed that creativity can be a weapon. The Ghost Army soldiers were not trained infantry, they were artists and technicians. But by applying their creative skills to military problems, they created solutions that conventional soldiers could not. They thought outside traditional military frameworks, which allowed them to accomplish missions in unconventional ways. Second, the Ghost Army demonstrated the value of deception in warfare. Deception has always been part of military strategy, but the Ghost Army showed it could be systematized and scaled. They developed techniques that could be applied repeatedly across different situations. They created a methodology for deception that other units could learn and use. This made deception a reliable tool rather than an improvised trick. Third, the Ghost Army showed that small, specialized units could have disproportionate impact. 1,100 men conducting deception operations saved thousands of lives by misdirecting German forces. A conventional military unit of 1,100 men would have been insignificant in a war involving millions of soldiers. But by doing something different, the Ghost Army achieved outsized effects. This principal specialization and unique capabilities can create leverage, has influenced military thinking ever since. Fourth, the Ghost Army demonstrated that military effectiveness requires diverse skills. Armies need soldiers who can fight, but they also need soldiers who can think, create, analyze, and improvise. The Ghost Army soldiers brought skills from civilian life that conventional military training did not provide. Their artistic backgrounds gave them unique capabilities. Modern militaries have learned this lesson. Special operations forces now actively recruit people with diverse backgrounds, including technical specialists, language experts, and yes, creative professionals. The Ghost Army also left a cultural legacy. Their story appeals to people because it shows that intelligence and creativity can triumph over brute force. It is a David and Goliath story, a small unit with fake equipment defeating a powerful enemy through cleverness. In a war characterized by industrial scale killing and mechanical warfare, the Ghost Army represented human ingenuity. They proved that individual creativity still mattered even in an age of tanks and bombers. For the art world, the Ghost Army represents an unusual intersection of art and war. Several Ghost Army veterans became important artists after the war. Their military service influenced their artistic development in complex ways. They had used artistic skills for practical military purposes, which gave them different perspectives on what art could do. Some, like Ellsworth Kelly, incorporated lessons about perception and form that they learned doing camouflage work. Others, like Bill Blass, applied principles of design and illusion they learned in the Ghost Army to their commercial work. The Ghost Army showed that artistic training had applications beyond fine art, that creativity was valuable in unexpected contexts. For military historians, the Ghost Army provides a case study in deception operations. The documents declassified in 1996 allow detailed analysis of how the operations were planned and executed. Researchers can study what worked and what did not. They can see how deception was integrated with conventional military operations. They can examine how German intelligence responded to deception and what factors made deception effective. This historical record enriches understanding of World War II and provides lessons for future conflicts. The story of the Ghost Army is the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things through creativity and courage. 1,100 American soldiers, most of them young men in their early 20s, used inflatable tanks sound effects and fake radio transmissions to fool one of the most powerful military machines in history. They operated close to enemy lines, often under fire, creating illusions that saved thousands of lives. They did this not with superior firepower, but with imagination and skill. They were artists and technicians who became warriors known